help and good medical care, Isabelle is making progress. She's beginning to have enough strength to set goals and think about the future.
Je rêverais d'avoir un enfant.
I really want to have a child, and I hope my body will allow me to. My doctor says it's possible.
Non, mon médecin m'a dit que c'était possible.
It is possible. C'était
C'est
possible.
possible encore.
Yes, it's possible.
Je suis encore en aménorrhée.
I'm still not having periods. My body is too weak, but he says it is possible. I'm with somebody now. I don't want to say very much because it's a bit complicated. At the moment, it's more an affair of the heart than a physical relationship. Because simply, I'm still very thin, and it's still very difficult to enjoy normal physical relations with such a tiny body, and a man who is a normal size. I'm still nervous about having sex.
Mais j'en parle pas trop.
What do you see in your future?
Bah, déjà, pouvoir vivre.
First of all, to be able to live.
Et de porter
So I'm trying to get better and to show that you can get better. You can get better by fighting and believing, and by living your passion. And the theater is my passion, and I hope to be able to realize my dream to continue with that passion.
Et mieux l'apprécier encore.
Isabelle has had some good news. The top-ranked drama school in France where she studied has agreed that she can return to class to live her passion.
So obviously we're doing a presentation over anorexia nervosa. Our article was titled Identification, Main Characteristics, and Treatment. It was discovered 130 years ago. The part where it says not many psychological studies is actually from another article we had planned on doing, but we decided to leave it in there. It was discovered 130 years ago, and there still aren't a whole lot of treatments as far as like actual ways to like treat them besides just like nourishing them back to health and stuff like that. There's very serious effects. Obviously, as you can see from the video, they said that 10% of the people affected by it end up dying. And it affects a lot of people. I mean, you can see from her body and brain, like it will affect someone tremendously. Like you can see the people looking at her on the street and stuff like that. Like it will affect like multiple areas of her life. It affects a lot of people. For example, like how many of you have never heard of a situation? I mean, besides the fact that you just watched a video about it, but how many of you have never seen or heard a story of someone suffering from anorexia? Before this, you've never heard of it at all?
Well, I've heard of the disease, but never heard of like someone with it. Yeah.
But it does affect a lot of people. Our article specifically looks at the identification of anorexia, like what causes it, epidemiology and stuff like that. What it looks like on the inside and out, how it affects the brain and different things like that. And they'll get into that later. And then the treatment of anorexia nervosa as they discovered it. All right, Ariel's going to come up and talk about the next part of it.
Okay. I'm going to explain how our article was set up and like what they were trying to find, which they were trying to find more about anorexia and really like what causes it and what the effects are on the body whenever someone has anorexia, because like Barry said, there's not much that people know about it, and even though it's been discovered for so long, they still don't know very much. And then this article also just gives people a lot of really good information about the disease and the illness and what it does and what the characteristics are and how to help people that have it. It also informs people of the ways to seek the right kind of treatment and how to prevent anorexia from later on. And the background is the article talks about it's more than just a physical illness the article discusses. It's a psychological and metabolic, and there's psychological and metabolic changes that happen in the human body whenever they're starving themselves, basically. It discusses the long-term illness can prevent effects like physical disorders like osteoporosis and emotional and educational development disorders. It also says that we need to consider two factors about anorexia nervosa, which is right there. It says the variation and the denial. The variation is describing how the illness varies drastically from patient to patient to patient, And so you can't just like, it's going to be different with no matter like who you're dealing with, it's always going to change. And the denial is that patients that, like we saw in the Andrew video on Tuesday, patients that have anorexia deny it for a really long time. And typically it's the family that takes them to go seek treatment and actually gets them better because they are in denial that they even have a problem. The article also discusses that children who are still growing, it affects their growing. It slows down their growing, obviously, because they aren't eating, but it also affects later on in life them being able to be at the right height and weight levels in their age group, even after they have the disease. If you're a young child that starts anorexia nervosa, then you're going to suffer later on too, even if you're okay. So, and now Whitney's going to talk to you about the methodology and the findings.
Hello. Okay, so we actually did two articles, mainly one. Our first article was called Anorexia Nervosa Identification, Main Characteristics, and Treatment, and that was by Maria Gentile. And first she looked at the diagnostic criteria, what would, how this disease would be identified and diagnosed, and then she went into the epidemia and etiology, which is like who it affects and why, basically. And then she looked at the medical risks and treatment. And our second article was called The Dearth of Psychological Treatment for Anorexia Nervosa, and that was by Daniel LaGrange and James Locke. And they used Medline and SciInfo to look up their studies, and they found 20 psychological treatments that were identified and divided into age and type of study. And okay, so how it was diagnosed, they looked at is by the how it is diagnosed is they looked at the DSM-4. They looked at a person's BMI, which is if it's less than 17.5 or less than 85% of expected weight, then that's one thing that they're like, oh, you're anorexic. And also, as Ariel said, failure to grow in a child, fear of weight gain or becoming fat, maybe avoiding fatty foods, self-induced vomiting, overexercise, and also hormonal changes. Okay. This disease usually begins in adolescence, mainly in women, but it happens everywhere. And as we learned from the video last time, that these eating disorders have the highest death rate of any mental illness. Now, anorexia nervosa, although they have like signs that in other diseases like intestinal disease and hormonal disorder, like, you know, their hormones are off balance, or what is different from those diseases than anorexia nervosa is the thought in anorexia that they can't gain weight. They have a fear of that. And that fear is absent in the other diseases. And so factors that might contribute to anorexia nervosa, like family, which would be low parent contact, death of a parent, and high expectations. Personality factors would be childhood obesity, prematurity, and restricted dieting. Psychological characteristics would be like having a negative self-image and perfectionism. And then there's sociocultural factors where there's cultural idealism, like the cultural says if you don't look like this model, then you're not good enough. And in conclusion, the aims of treatment for anorexia nervosa are to prevent morbidity and mortality by restoring body weight and correcting malnutrition. Also to correct dysfunctional behavior and thinking, to treat depression and obsessive thinking, restore autonomy and prevent relapse, and the studies increase our knowledge, studies for this increase our knowledge and direct the future of psychotherapy. And now Ariel's going to do the worldview.
We looked up 2 different Bible verses for our worldview, we chose Mark 14:38, which says, "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." And we also looked up Philippians 4:6-7, which is, do not be anxious about anything, but instead pray by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. And we just thought that these 2 verses corresponded with anorexia and how girls don't need to be anxious and worry about what the world says about how you need to look. They just need to understand that God thinks that we're perfect, and God made us all perfectly, and He made us in His image. And so there's no reason to be scared or be anxious or want to be like someone else, and we should just be who we are supposed to be. So that's our presentation of anorexia.
Okay, of course she came up with at least 3 questions while you watched this. Did you watch this presentation? Forgot about that. Anybody have a question for them?
I have a question. What does dearth mean?
Like the dying out of, let's see what the article is called again. Yeah, dearth is basically the dying out of psychological treatment, and that's, or the diminishing, and their point on that